I was betrayed by my own company after 30 years, then the CEO discovered the truth and everything exploded. The security badge Harold Baker had swiped every morning for 30 years suddenly felt like a lie in his trembling fingers. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, 37 people were celebrating his retirement without him. His own retirement party. The one they said was just for senior staff. Harold's coffee had gone stone cold hours ago, but he kept lifting the ceramic mug to his lips anyway, anything to keep his hands busy while his world collapsed in real time. The banner hanging crooked above the conference room buffet table might as well have been his obituary. "Thank you Harold, 30 years of service," in corporate blue letters that looked like they'd been hastily printed at Office Max 20 minutes before the party started. Inside that glass prison, Marcus Williams was gesturing wildly with a wine glass, red liquid sloshing dangerously close to his pristine white shirt. Marcus, the same Marcus who Harold had found 6 years ago living in his parents' basement, 26 years old and convinced he was unemployable because he couldn't make eye contact during job interviews. Harold had hired him anyway, stayed late for months teaching him everything about client relations, even drove to Marcus's apartment at 2 a.m. when the Peterson Electronics crisis hit and Marcus had a panic attack. Now Marcus was entertaining the senior staff with animated stories about that very crisis, the one where Harold had worked 72 straight hours rebuilding their entire server system from backup drives and pure desperation. The crisis that had saved Peterson Electronics' product launch and earned Marcus a $20,000 commission. Harold had slept under his desk for a week, living on gas station coffee and sheer willpower, while Marcus got the glory. But Marcus wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Sarah Chin carry paper plates like she owned the place, laughing at jokes from David Hutchinson, the VP who'd been there 8 months and still called Harold Bob despite being corrected 23 times. Sarah, who'd been working 3 part-time jobs just to make rent when Harold convinced the previous HR director to take a chance on her. Harold had personally trained her in project management, stayed late to help her study for her certification, even lent her $800 for the exam fee when her transmission died the same week as the test. Now Sarah was pulling down 6 figures and driving a BMW, while Harold sat at his ancient desk with a monitor that flickered every time someone used the microwave. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife Margaret: "How's your big day, honey? I can't wait to hear about all the speeches. Did they give you something special? Take pictures of everything." Harold stared at the message until the words blurred. Margaret had been planning this day for months. She'd already booked their cruise to Alaska, printed brochures for the RV they were going to buy, started talking to their daughter Jessica about finally taking that trip to Ireland. She'd been so proud, bragging to the neighbors about her husband's big retirement celebration. If only she knew her husband was spending his big day watching it happen without him. The conference room door opened, and Jennifer Martinez walked in carrying a stack of paper plates. 28-year-old Jennifer with her MBA and her nervous finger drumming and her ability to deliver corporate death sentences with surgical precision. Jennifer, who Harold had personally hired when she was so green she couldn't complete a phone interview without stammering. He'd seen something in her then, the same desperate hunger he'd felt 30 years ago when he first walked through these doors with nothing but a community college degree and an unshakable belief that hard work mattered. Now Jennifer was the one who told him his own retirement party was just for senior staff. Senior staff. Harold almost laughed at the bitter irony. When he'd started in 1994, there was no digital solutions department. There was Harold, a folding card table someone had dragged up from the basement, and a gateway computer with 8 megabytes of RAM that crashed every time the microwave ran. His office was a converted supply closet that still reeked of industrial cleaning fluid and broken dreams. But Harold had built something from that nothing. He'd grown digital solutions from a one-man operation into a 43-person department that generated 37% of Meridian Industries' annual revenue. He had the spreadsheets to prove it, 30 years of meticulously tracked metrics, milestone achievements, and victory after victory. Not because anyone had asked him to track them, but because he'd always believed that eventually, someone would want to know. Someone would care about the foundation he'd built brick by brick, crisis by crisis, 18-hour day by 18-hour day. He'd been catastrophically wrong. Harold's computer screen flickered again, the same monitor he'd been using for 6 years, held together with electrical tape and hope. He'd submitted 3 separate replacement requests, each one denied for budget considerations. Meanwhile, the conference room where his retirement party was happening without him had a 75-inch smart TV that was mainly used to stream March Madness during lunch breaks. His desk phone rang with an internal extension he didn't recognize. Harold speaking. "Mr. Baker. This is Tom from Facilities." The voice sounded uncomfortable, like Tom was reading from a script he didn't want to deliver. "I'm supposed to come by Friday morning to collect your computer equipment and office supplies. Also need to arrange access to your files for the transition. Harold's chest tightened. What transition? Tom clearly hadn't expected questions. I just got the work order, sir. Says here you're retiring end of week and they need to reassign your accounts to other staff members. Reassign to who? Doesn't specify. Just says to box everything up and deliver it to Mr. Hutchinson's office. David Hutchinson's office. The VP who'd been there 8 months and thought Harold's name was Bob. The man who was about to inherit 30 years of Harold's institutional knowledge, client relationships, and carefully documented processes. I'll have everything ready, Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. After hanging up, Harold sat in the artificial silence of his corner workspace. Through the glass wall, someone had dimmed the conference room lights and was setting up a projector. Probably for a slideshow about the department's achievements. They loved their PowerPoint presentations at corporate events. Harold wondered if they'd included any photos from the early days, back when the entire department could fit around a single folding table. Back when everyone knew exactly who had built what, who had sacrificed what, who had earned what. Probably not. Those photos would show Harold front and center, sleeves rolled up, working alongside people who now pretended he was furniture. Harold pulled open his desk drawer and began sifting through 30 years of accumulated evidence. Business cards from clients who'd moved on. Commendation letters from supervisors who'd been promoted or transferred or laid off in various corporate restructurings. A coffee mug Jessica had made him in high school, world's greatest dad, painted in shaky blue letters that had faded but never quite disappeared. At the bottom of the drawer sat his victory file, a thick folder he'd maintained religiously since his early days, filled with documentation of every major success, every crisis averted, every innovation implemented. Email thank yous from grateful clients. Internal memos praising his extraordinary dedication. Even a handwritten note from the company president calling Harold irreplaceable. 30 years of being irreplaceable, and they'd replaced him without even letting him watch. The Peterson Electronics disaster was all there in black and white, not just Harold's after-action report, but thank you emails from the client, internal recognition from management, documentation proving that Harold's 72-hour marathon had saved the company's biggest contract. Also documented, the Morrison Systems integration that had saved $2 million in licensing fees, the Chen Industries database redesign that increased processing speed by 400%, the Williams Corp security overhaul that prevented what could have been a catastrophic data breach. Evidence that apparently mattered to no one but Harold. His personal email chimed. Margaret again, I keep thinking about how proud I am of you. 30 years of dedication, and now everyone gets to see what I've always known, that you're extraordinary. Can't wait to celebrate with you tonight. Harold stared at the message until his vision blurred. How was he supposed to go home and tell his wife that her extraordinary husband had spent his extraordinary day watching his own celebration through soundproof glass? How could he explain that after 3 decades of sacrifice, his reward was a pension calculation that would barely cover their basic expenses? The cruise Margaret had booked would have to be cancelled. The RV was definitely out of the question. Their daughter's wedding next year would stretch their threadbare budget to the breaking point. He typed back, can't wait to tell you all about it. Another lie in a growing collection. He'd been telling himself lies for years, lies like, they'll recognize my contributions eventually, and, loyalty will be rewarded, and, hard work speaks for itself. The biggest lie of all, I'm okay with how this turned out. Through the glass wall, the slideshow had begun. Harold could see flashes of color reflecting off the conference room walls, charts and graphs showing digital solutions' meteoric growth over the past 3 decades. Revenue increases, client satisfaction scores, efficiency improvements. All the metrics Harold had obsessively tracked and reported, hoping someone would notice the direct correlation between his efforts and the company's success. They'd probably edited him out of those slides too, but then something changed in the conference room's atmosphere. The laughter stopped mid-sentence. Conversations died so abruptly that the sudden silence felt physical. Through the glass, Harold could see people straightening their postures, adjusting their clothes, suddenly looking like children caught misbehaving. Someone very important had just arrived. Harold looked toward the elevator bank and felt his pulse spike. Richard Thornton, CEO of Meridian Industries, legend of the 40th floor, the man who'd grown their mid-sized regional company into a national powerhouse, was walking across the office floor with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. In 30 years, Harold had spoken to Thornton exactly 5 times, never for more than 2 minutes, usually just polite hellos in passing. Thornton's world was corner offices and board meetings and strategic decisions that affected thousands of employees. He didn't make social calls to retirement parties for mid-level staff, but there he was, heading directly for Harold's retirement party. The retirement party Harold wasn't invited to attend. Harold watched in fascination as Thornton entered the conference room. The effect was immediate and devastating. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. The easy corporate chatter evaporated instantly. David Hutchinson, who moments before had been holding court with practiced confidence, suddenly looked like an imposter wearing his father's suit. Thornton stood in the doorway, surveying the scene with the methodical attention of a general inspecting troops. Even from 20 feet away, Harold could see the CEO's expression shifting as he took in the banner, the cake, the assembled crowd. Confusion gave way to understanding, understanding gave way to something that looked dangerously close to rage. Harold couldn't hear the words, but he'd become expert at reading lips after decades of conference calls where he wasn't important enough to speak. Thornton was scanning the room systematically, clearly looking for someone specific. Then Harold saw the CEO's mouth form the words that would replay in his mind forever, "Where's Mr. Baker?" The question hit the room like a physical blow. Harold watched 37 people suddenly find the floor fascinating. David Hutchinson stepped forward, leaning close to whisper something in Thornton's ear. Harold could see the VP gesturing vaguely toward the office area, could see him mouth the words that explained everything. He wasn't invited. What happened next would become the stuff of corporate legend. Richard Thornton's face underwent a transformation that Harold had never seen in 30 years of observing executive behavior. The confusion and irritation from moments before were nothing compared to what crossed the CEO's features now. It wasn't just anger, it was disgust, disappointment, and what looked almost like personal betrayal. Thornton stepped back from Hutchinson like the man had just confessed to embezzlement. He looked around the room again, this time with an expression that made everyone present seem to physically shrink. Harold could see people actually backing away, instinctively putting distance between themselves and whatever was about to explode. Then Thornton spoke, and even through the soundproof glass, Harold could hear the tone, sharp, final, absolute. Whatever the CEO was saying, it wasn't a suggestion or a request. It was a verdict. Harold watched in stunned amazement as 37 people began setting down wine glasses, abandoning conversations, and filing toward the door like they were evacuating a burning building. The party was over. Not winding down, over. Finished by executive decree. But Thornton wasn't done. Instead of following the crowd toward the elevators, he turned away from the chaos he'd just created and walked directly across the office floor to Harold's desk. "Mr. Baker," Thornton said, settling into the chair beside Harold's workspace like he had all the time in the world. His voice was tired, not angry despite what Harold had just witnessed. Just bone-deep tired. "I believe I owe you an apology." "Several apologies, actually." Harold looked up from his victory file, scattered across the desk like evidence in a cold case. Behind Thornton, the conference room was emptying rapidly. People were filing out with their heads down, carrying half-empty wine glasses and expressions of confused panic. Jennifer was frantically making phone calls. David Hutchinson stood alone near the abandoned buffet table, his face the color of the wine he'd been drinking. "I just told them to cancel that party," Thornton continued, his eyes never leaving Harold's face. "Told them I'm not celebrating anything without the man who built it." Harold's throat felt desert dry. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate that, but—" "30 years," the CEO interrupted, and Harold heard something dangerous in his voice. 30 years you've been here, building this department from absolutely nothing, and they told you it was just for senior staff." Thornton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than any shout. "Do you know what I told them in there, Mr. Baker?" Harold shook his head, not trusting his voice. "I told them that if Harold Baker isn't senior staff after 30 years of single-handedly creating this company's most profitable department, then we have a fundamental problem with how Meridian Industries defines value and leadership." Through the glass wall, Harold could see facilities staff already taking down the banner. The celebration that had excluded him was being dismantled as efficiently as it had been erected. "I told them," Thornton continued, "that any party celebrating digital solution success that doesn't center around the man who created that success isn't just insulting, it's corporate fraud." Harold stared at the CEO, waiting for the punchline, the qualification, but that would make this moment make sense. It didn't come. Instead, Thornton stood up, straightening his tie with the same methodical precision he'd used to survey the party. "Mr. Baker, I came down here today because I wanted to personally congratulate the man who'd been running our most successful department for 3 decades. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the guest of honor had been deliberately excluded from his own celebration." Harold looked down at the pension calculation still sitting on his desk, the number that represented everything he'd worked for, saved for, planned for. The number that would barely cover basic expenses and had already forced him to start making painful compromises about his future. There was probably some kind of miscommunication about the invitation process, Harold began. There was no miscommunication, Thornton said flatly. There was a deliberate decision to exclude you from recognition you'd earned. And that decision tells me everything I need to know about the leadership culture that's developed in this department while I wasn't paying attention. The CEO paused, studying Harold's face with the intensity of someone making a critical calculation. Mr. Baker, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. After 30 years of service, after building a department that generates over a third of this company's revenue, after training half the people who just walked out of that room with their heads hung in shame, do you really want to retire? Harold looked at his victory file spread across the desk, 30 years of documented contributions that apparently no one in management had bothered to review. He looked at the pension calculation that represented financial insecurity disguised as reward. He looked through the glass wall at the empty conference room where his career had just been celebrated without him. I honestly don't know, he said. Thornton nodded slowly. That's the most honest answer I've heard in this building in years. Here's what's going to happen. Your retirement party, your real retirement party, will be held next Friday in the executive conference room on the 40th floor. I will personally ensure that everyone who should be there will be there, and I will personally guarantee that your contributions to this company are properly recognized and properly compensated. He started to walk away, then turned back with an expression Harold had never seen on an executive's face, genuine regret. But between now and then, I want you to consider something. I've been CEO of this company for 15 years, and I've made decisions I'm proud of and decisions that keep me awake at night. But allowing talent like yours to be overlooked, allowing someone who's contributed as much as you have to be treated as disposable, that's not just a business mistake. It's a moral failure. My failure. Thornton took a step closer, lowering his voice. One more thing, Mr. Baker. After Friday's celebration, after you've had time to process everything that's happened here today, I'd like to have a private conversation about your future with this company. Because frankly, after witnessing what I just witnessed, I'm not convinced that Meridian Industries can afford to lose you. As the CEO walked toward the elevator, Harold sat in stunned silence. Around him, the office was slowly returning to its normal rhythm, but nothing would ever be normal again. His computer pinged with an email from Jennifer. Harold, please disregard my earlier message about desk cleanup. There have been significant changes to your transition timeline. We'll provide updated information soon. Jay, his phone rang. Margaret's voice was confused, almost scared. Harold? I just got the strangest call from someone at your office. They said something about problems with the retirement party. I didn't understand what they were trying to tell me. What's happening? Harold looked around the transformed landscape of his final day, at colleagues returning to their desks with shell-shocked expressions, at the empty conference room being cleaned by maintenance staff, at the victory file that had suddenly become relevant again after 30 years of being ignored. 30 years of building something from nothing. 30 years of being overlooked, undervalued, taken for granted by people who'd forgotten that everything they celebrated had been built on his sacrifice. And then, in one afternoon, everything had changed. But this was just the beginning. Harold could feel it in his bones. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the moment his real story finally began. Margaret, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years, you're not going to believe what just happened. And honestly, I don't think I believe it myself yet. Have you ever been completely overlooked at work despite carrying the entire team? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear about the moment you realized your loyalty wasn't being returned. And if you've ever seen a boss finally stand up for the right person at the right moment, tell us what happened next. Don't forget to subscribe because Harold's story is just getting started, and what happens in the executive boardroom next week will change everything. Share this with anyone who's ever felt invisible at work. Sometimes the right person is watching, even when you think nobody cares. The executive elevator to the 40th floor moved with the kind of whisper-quiet precision that only existed in the upper stratosphere of corporate power. Harold Baker had never been in this elevator before. In 30 years, he'd never had reason to ascend beyond the 8th floor where Digital Solutions lived and breathed and generated 37% of Meridian Industries' revenue. Now, clutching a leather portfolio that felt foreign in his work-worn hands, Harold watched the floor numbers climb past departments he'd only heard about in company newsletters. Legal. Strategic planning. Executive operations. Each floor represented a level of corporate hierarchy he'd never imagined penetrating. 7 days had passed since Richard Thornton had cancelled Harold's retirement party and promised him a real celebration. 7 days that had transformed Meridian Industries into something Harold barely recognized. David Hutchinson was gone. Not reassigned, not transferred, gone. Rumor had it he'd been walked out by security Tuesday morning, his corporate credit cards deactivated before he'd even cleaned out his desk. The official announcement cited strategic realignment of departmental leadership, but everyone knew the truth. Hutchinson had been executed for excluding Harold from his own retirement party. Sarah Chen had been called into HR 3 times. Marcus Williams was suddenly working weekends for the first time in years, desperately trying to document processes that had lived solely in Harold's institutional memory. Jennifer Martinez looked like she hadn't slept since the incident, jumping every time her phone rang. But the most shocking change was in how people treated Harold himself. "Good morning, Mr. Baker," called out Patricia from accounting, the same woman who'd walked past his desk for 15 years without acknowledgement. "Congratulations on your big day." "Thanks, Patricia," Harold replied, still adjusting to being visible after 3 decades of corporate invisibility. The elevator dinged softly at the 40th floor, and Harold stepped into a world he'd only imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. The carpet was thick enough to absorb footsteps completely. Even the air felt different up here, filtered, climate-controlled, expensive. "Mr. Baker." A woman in her 30s approached with the confident stride of executive assistants. "I'm Linda Reeves, Mr. Thornton's chief of staff. He's waiting for you in the Aurora conference room." Harold followed Linda down a hallway lined with oil paintings and awards, past offices with doors thick enough to stop sound completely. The Aurora conference room was larger than Harold's entire original department had been in 1994, mahogany table, leather chairs, and windows that made the city look like a detailed model spread out below. But it was the people gathered around the table that made Harold's breath catch. Richard Thornton sat at the head, flanked by the entire C-suite. Chief Financial Officer Rebecca Walsh, who Harold had seen maybe twice in 30 years. Chief Operating Officer Michael Chen, Sarah's older brother and someone Harold had helped train back when Michael was an intern. Chief Technology Officer David Park, who'd started in digital solutions under Harold's mentorship before being promoted to the executive level. And at the far end of the table, looking distinctly uncomfortable, sat the board of directors representative, Eleanor Morrison, a silver-haired woman whose family had founded Morrison Industries, the company Meridian had acquired 12 years ago in the deal that Harold had made possible. "Mr. Baker," Thornton stood as Harold entered. "Thank you for joining us. Please, take a seat." Harold sat in the leather chair to Thornton's right, a position that, he realized with growing amazement, placed him at the executive table as an equal rather than a presenter. "Before we begin the formal celebration," Thornton said, "I want to address something that's been troubling me all week. Mrs. Morrison, would you like to explain to Mr. Baker why you're here?" Eleanor Morrison cleared her throat, her discomfort obvious. "Mr. Baker, I owe you a personal apology. 12 years ago, when Meridian acquired Morrison Industries, I was told the integration was handled by Meridian's digital team. I never knew there was one person, you, who personally managed every aspect of that transition." She paused, consulting notes with hands that weren't quite steady. "Yesterday, Mr. Thornton provided me with documentation showing that you worked 18-hour days for 3 months straight to ensure our employees kept their jobs, our systems remained operational, and our clients experienced zero service interruption. You saved my family's company, Mr. Baker. And I never even knew your name." Harold stared at her, remembering those brutal months in 2013. The Morrison acquisition had been chaos, incompatible systems, panicking employees, clients threatening to jump ship. Harold had essentially lived at the office, rebuilding everything from the ground up while management focused on the financial aspects of the deal. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "I've discovered that the Morrison integration model you developed has been used as the template for 6 subsequent acquisitions, generating an estimated $43 million in cost savings and retained revenue. None of our board materials ever mentioned your contribution." CFO Rebecca Walsh leaned forward. "Mr. Baker, I've spent the week reviewing 30 years of financial data. Do you know what I found?" Harold shook his head. "Every major revenue increase in digital solutions correlates directly with initiatives you implemented. The Peterson Electronics recovery. The Chin Industries database optimization. The Williams Corp security overhaul. The Morrison integration. 17 different crisis interventions that saved or generated a combined $237 million. She slid a thick report across the table. "This analysis should have been done years ago. Decades ago. The fact that it wasn't represents a systemic failure in how this company recognizes and rewards value creation." COO Michael Chen spoke next, his voice tight with emotion. "Harold, I need to tell you something personal. When I was an intern, confused and intimidated and sure I was going to wash out, you spent hours after work teaching me database architecture. You never made me feel stupid for not understanding something. You never made me feel like I was wasting your time." He gestured around the table. 3 people in this room, myself, David Park, and indirectly Eleanor through the Morrison integration, owe their careers to your mentorship and expertise. We've all benefited from your knowledge while you remained at the same salary level you held 15 years ago. CTO David Park nodded grimly. The Peterson electronics crisis that everyone talks about. Harold didn't just fix the servers. He redesigned our entire backup protocol, implemented redundant systems, and created the disaster recovery procedures we still use today. That work alone has prevented at least 12 potential system failures over the past 6 years. Thornton raised his hand, and the room fell silent. "Mr. Baker, what you're hearing represents the conclusions of the most thorough personnel review in Meridian Industries history. A review that should have happened annually for the past 3 decades. He stood, walking to the windows overlooking the city. "Here's what we've discovered. Digital Solutions generates 37% of our revenue, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Your crisis interventions have prevented an estimated $68 million in lost business. Your integration work has saved $43 million in acquisition costs. Your training and mentorship has developed talent that now generates revenue across multiple departments." Thornton turned back to face Harold. "In other words, Mr. Baker, you haven't just been an employee for 30 years. You've been the backbone that's held this entire company together." Harold felt something strange happening to his vision. The room seemed to be getting brighter, details becoming sharper. After 30 years of being invisible, he was suddenly the center of attention in a way that felt almost overwhelming. "Which brings us," Thornton continued, "to the question of what happens now." Linda Reeves placed a manila folder in front of Harold. Inside were documents with Meridian Industries letterhead, official, legal, permanent-looking documents. "Mr. Baker, Meridian Industries is offering you the position of Chief Innovation Officer, reporting directly to me. Your responsibilities would include overseeing all technology integrations, managing crisis response protocols, and developing the next generation of department leaders." Harold stared at the job description. The salary figure made his eyes widen. It was more than triple what he'd been making as a senior analyst. "But that's not all," Rebecca Walsh added. "We're also issuing you a retention bonus equal to the difference between what you should have been earning and what you actually earned over the past 15 years. With interest." She slid another document across the table. The number at the bottom made Harold's hands shake. "Additionally," Eleanor Morrison said, "the board is voting to grant you equity participation in all future acquisitions where your integration expertise is utilized. You've been creating value for other people long enough, Mr. Baker. It's time you participated in the rewards." Harold looked around the table at faces that had been corporate names to him just a week ago. Now they were people who'd spent 7 days digging through 30 years of his contributions, quantifying his value, acknowledging his impact. "There's one more thing," Thornton said quietly. "This offer comes with a condition." Harold tensed. Here it was, the catch that would make everything make sense. "The condition is that you help me fix the cultural problems that allowed this situation to develop in the first place. I want you to review every department, every management structure, every promotion and recognition system. I want you to find every other Harold Baker who's been overlooked, undervalued, or forgotten." Thornton leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I want you to help me build a company where talent is recognized, where loyalty is rewarded, and where someone can never again spend 30 years building something only to be excluded from celebrating it." Harold looked at the documents spread before him: job offer, compensation adjustment, equity agreements. Numbers that would change his life, Margaret's life, Jessica's wedding plans, their retirement dreams. But more than that, he saw an opportunity to ensure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else. "Mr. Thornton," Harold said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I have one question." "Of course. When do I start?" The room erupted in applause, actual applause from the executive leadership of Meridian Industries. Harold Baker, who 7 days ago had watched his own retirement party through soundproof glass, was now being welcomed into the highest levels of corporate power. But even as he shook hands and accepted congratulations, Harold knew this was just the beginning. Because somewhere in this building, on floors he'd never visited, in departments he'd never heard of, there were other people building value in silence, creating success for others, waiting for recognition that might never come, unless Harold found them first. As the meeting broke up and executives filed out with promises to circle back on implementation details, Thornton lingered behind. "Harold," he said, dropping the formal "Mr. Baker" for the first time, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. How did you do it?" 30 years of being overlooked, undervalued, excluded. How did you keep going without becoming bitter? Harold thought about the question, about all the times he'd wanted to quit, all the moments of frustration and disappointment and quiet rage. I think, he said finally, I always believed that good work eventually gets recognized. I was wrong about the timeline, but I wasn't wrong about the principle. Thornton nodded slowly. Well, you're about to find out just how right you were. Because starting Monday, recognizing good work is going to be your primary job responsibility. As Harold rode the elevator back down to the 8th floor to collect his real things, not the sad cardboard box of personal items he'd expected to carry out a week ago, he thought about Margaret waiting at home, about Jessica planning her wedding, about the future that had just completely transformed. But mostly, he thought about Monday morning, when he'd start his new job with a simple mission: make sure no one else ever had to watch their own celebration through glass. The elevator dinged softly at the 8th floor, and Harold stepped out into his old world one last time. Tomorrow, everything would be different. What would you do with Harold's new power? Have you ever seen someone finally get the recognition they deserved after years of being overlooked? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're currently the Harold in your workplace, share your story. You never know who might be reading. Subscribe now, because next week we're diving into Harold's first day as Chief Innovation Officer, and the discoveries he makes will expose just how deep this problem goes. Share this with anyone who's ever felt undervalued at work. Sometimes justice isn't just served, it's promoted to the C-suite.